So welcome back. I hope you all had an enjoyable lunch and had an opportunity to network dialogue and visit the very interesting posters and exhibitor. If not, we'll have another break opportunity at 2:30. I'm delighted to be moderating this exciting panel entitled Policy Approaches to Marketing Towards Children, an overview of different policy approaches towards banning marketing towards children and the pros and cons of each. This afternoon's second and final panel is intended to demonstrate that there are no perfect policy options, that every option comes with strengths and weaknesses. When choosing an option, one must consider the tensions that exist in trying to balance interests and values and the need to understand the roles and responsibilities of the various stakeholders like parents and government. What age children should be protected at? Who decides what's healthy and what's unhealthy? And where do we draw the line? Hear about why experts and interested stakeholders have drawn the lines on these issues. This panel will help to raise and discuss the right issues in this important public health matter. I'm pleased to present to you the panelists starting, and I'll read their bios, Bill Jeffery, Manuel Arango, and Ken Wong. So Bill Jeffery is the National Coordinator for the Center for Science and Public Interest. CSPI advocates for reforms by informing approximately 100 subscribers to its Nutrition Action Health Letter, appearing before federal and provincial legislative committees, participating in public and expert consultations by provincial, federal, and international government bodies, and speaking to the media. Bill is a member of the Law Society of Upper Canada. He articled with the Public Interest Advocacy Centre, a national consumer protection clinic, and is a graduate of the University of Alberta Faculty of Law. Our next panelist is Manuel Arango. Manny has been a proponent for restrictions on the marketing of unhealthy food and beverages to children through his membership in the Ontario Disease Prevention Alliance of Canada, and in his current position as Director of Health Policy at the Heart and Stroke Foundation. At HSF, Manuel is responsible for the health policy, health promotion, and the government relations advocacy functions. He liaises with national organizations and individuals working in cardiovascular health and chronic disease prevention management in order to advance the Foundation's policy objectives. He also oversees the Foundation's advocacy efforts and the communication of the Foundation's mission-related priorities with parliamentarians and government officials. Ultimately, his role is to ensure that effective policy and government relations decisions are undertaken by the Foundation. He acts as a spokesperson for the Foundation with the media on a variety of issues. Our last panelist is Ken Wong, who's a distinguished professor of marketing at Queen's University, where he has held both teaching and the administrative positions. He is also the managing partner of knowledge development at the Level 5 Strategy Group, a brand consulting firm in Toronto. In addition, Ken has written for the Financial Times, Globe and Mail, Financial Post, Strategy, Marketing, and a host of trade publications. He routinely addresses business, government, and trade association audiences around the world and serves on a number of advisory boards and the boards of directors of private and not-for-profit firms. He's a member of the Canadian Marketing Hall of Legends and a winner of the National Post Leaders in Management Education, both awards recognizing his lifetime contribution to management education. He has taught at Queen's, Dalhousie, University of Alberta, York, Harvard, and Cornell. So I will welcome our first panelist, Bill Jeffery, to the podium. Thank you.
I have a pretty bad cold, so if I fall down, don't worry. Daniel and I planned it that way. I'll try to do most of my presentation from the seat over there. But anyway, I'll start by telling you a little bit about the Center for Science and the Public Interest. We're a nonprofit health advocacy organization. We have 100,000 subscribers to our newsletter, not 100. So that's what pays my salary, and that's what funds our advocacy. And we don't accept funding from industry or government. We are motivated by a public health mandate to reduce the number of deaths due to nutrition-related illness mostly. Our U.S. office does a lot of work on food safety, but we primarily focus on nutrition in Canada. And we rely on mostly estimates from the World Health Organization, U.S. Institute of Medicine, that indicate that as many as 5 years of healthy life expectancy are lost due to nutrition-related illness, extrapolating from U.S. World Health Organization multipliers. Approximately 48,000 deaths in Canada are attributable to nutrition-related illnesses, and this was this estimate was taken up by the the Drummond Commission report, which I think is significant for this province. Your throne speech referred to it again recently. And various estimates of the economic burden of nutrition-related illness peg it at between $5 and $30 billion a year across Canada. Recently, the World Health Organization has joined other countries, I guess, in agreeing to this target of reducing non-communicable diseases by 25% by the year 2025. That is an enormous undertaking. And, by our very rough estimates, the Canadian government would have to implement every single one of our recommendations to achieve this target and take a lot stronger actions on tobacco control and excess alcohol consumption. Among those is restricting advertising directed at children. Many of you, I'm sure, know about how we do our work, but we talk to the media, we intervene at legislative committees, publish reports, meet elected officials, organize coalitions. And so I'm going to plug very briefly 4 coalitions recent. There's a little sign-up sheet there in front of, if you wouldn't mind, there are 2 of them. Pardon me, circulating them around the tables. If people want more information, please sign that, return it to me, and just give your contact information. I'll be sure you get information about it. Okay, number 1, Sodium Reduction Strategy for Canada Act. It's before the House of Commons, so it will come up for a vote probably sometime in April. We've organized a coalition of 42 groups, all the major health groups, Canadian Nurse Association, Canadian Medical Association, Dietitians of Canada, Hypertension Canada, on and on, not just national groups, but also provincial and local groups. I'm hoping that we can hit 100, and we've got lots of other ideas in mind to help rein in those last couple of dozen votes that we need to make it pass. We're also, in the next 1 to 4 months, we hope to see several proposals come forward for mandating nutrition information on restaurant menus. If you want to learn more about that and join the coalition of, at last count, 28 groups and experts, please let me know. We are part of a group that formed what's now called the Conflict of Interest Coalition. It's a group of 159 groups and networks around the world, 2,000 altogether, because some of them represent many groups, that basically advance the view that private companies and industry associations shouldn't be integrally involved in policy development because they have a material conflict of interest. And anyway, I'm happy to talk to you more about that later. Our newsletter, Nutrition Action Health Letter, is actually now available in an electronic format for groups. So I know there are a few groups in Canada that have access to it, so they can kind of email it around to their members. And I just thought I would bring that to your attention. And finally, of course, Bill C-430, which is a federal bill that restrict advertising directed at children, very much like the Quebec bill, or the Quebec law, with a couple of glosses, one of which it was extended to food labeling. You can imagine the impact of, labeling of Fruit Loops boxes or whatever on children. That, if it followed the normal course of things, it wouldn't be debated until 2014, I think. But there are many ways to expedite that if the circumstances are right. And I think it's one of those bills where, again, we're in a situation where a couple of dozen votes could make all the world a difference. So, I mean, we are known in Canada as being a strong proponent of the Quebec approach to restricting advertising directed at children, and not what I'll refer to as the UK approach, which is setting nutrition criteria. And I'm going to describe to you some of the reasons why we believe that, starting with the scientific evidence. And I should say that, for starters, Dr. Sheila Basrer, who unfortunately passed away a couple of years ago, was a real pioneer in Canada, and I think that Ontarians are right to be proud of her contribution to this. Her 2000 report, Chief Medical Officer of Health report, Healthy Weights, Healthy Lives, was really on the leading edge, and I think a lot of other groups are really following its example now, and she advocated exploring the Quebec model for Ontario. A large survey of the literature about advertising directed at children, mostly, almost exclusively for food, because that's where most of the research had been done, was conducted by Hastings and others at the University of Glasgow in 2003. That was when it was published in 2003. And the conclusions of it were basically that most food advertised to children is junk food. And there's reasonably strong evidence to indicate that it's effective in changing, increasing the likelihood of children preferring that type of food. Anyway, it's mostly a reflection of there are only, I think, about between 50 and 100 studies, depending on how you describe them. Anyway, that's the chief conclusion of it. And I could get into the finer points about it, but one of the things that they also emphasized is that young children lack the cognitive maturity to properly interpret commercial advertising. And certainly when they're under 8 years old, that's where most of the evidence is. But the feeling was that that maturity is really just starting to develop at that age, between the ages of 8 and 12. Okay. Likewise, the U.S. Institute of Medicine essentially replicated this approach to studying. And again, they found that children are just beginning to develop cognitive skills at age 8, and that there's very little research on their level of maturity between the ages of 12 and 18. The American Psychological Association did a much more exhaustive review of the literature respecting cognitive development, and they had some more precise conclusions. But again, they found that media literacy training was essentially not very effective in helping children guard against commercial advertising, and that they basically don't understand it. And really, they don't understand at very young ages, they don't even really understand what advertisements are, and later they don't have the cognitive defenses for maturely interpreting them. Many of you, I'm sure, are aware of the U.S. or the Canadian Supreme Court decision, 1989, Irwin Toy. That was a decision where a toy company challenged the Quebec law prohibiting advertising directed to children under the age of 13, all advertising, not just food advertising. And in upholding the law, they concluded that advertising directed at young children is per se manipulative. Such advertising aims to promote products by convincing those who will always believe. There are many other features of federal and provincial law in Canada that are very consistent with this theme. The Federal Competition Act, which ironically is supposed to protect the Canadian population against misleading advertising in part and other things. It stipulates that in order to make a complaint, a request for an investigation by the director or the commissioner, you have to be at least 18 years of age. The Canadian Evidence Act, which has important implications for what kind of evidence can be seriously entertained in court, creates a presumption that children under the age of 14 are not reliable witnesses. Their testimony is considered, but often under very specific terms. The Irwin Toy case, one of the justices that wrote an opinion in that acknowledged that the common law, which is applicable outside of Quebec, also shares this view that children are a kind of vulnerable group. And there's this general contract doctrine, which, as the justice said, indicates that children are not as equipped as adults to evaluate the persuasive force of advertising. And advertisements directed at children would take advantage of this. Justice for Children and Youth, which is a Toronto-based advocacy group, did a survey of almost 70 age-delimited legal milestones in Ontario. Some of them are federal, but and they found that really only 3 of them vest in children under the age of 12. And they're related to first of all, the right to go to school, and then later the duty to go to school, and then finally the authority to withhold consent to be adopted. Age of Majority and Accountability Act in Ontario specifies that the age of majority is 18 years old. This law was put in place not to raise it, but to lower it, because the common law principle was that children didn't become adults until they were 21 years old. and some other provinces actually say that you don't become an adult until you're well, some say you don't become an adult until you're 19, and others mostly at 18. The many provincial consumer protection statutes or business practices acts, various types of legislation like that, have restrictions on misleading advertising, deceptive advertising, unconscionable marketing practices, and others. And there is some appeal court level jurisprudence that indicates that in deciding whether something is misleading or deceptive, you have to take into consideration the audience to which the messages are being directed. And in my view, that means you have to consider the cognitive maturity of children. There's quite a lot of high-level support for that proposition. I'm pressing the forward button, nothing's happening. Oh.
Takes a while, I think, last hours.
I'm waiting for
How
time.
did you unglue it? Yeah, how did you unglue
Okay.
it?
It's area. You have to click on that. And it goes.
Okay, I guess we're good now. Interestingly, McDonald's, once in an effort to quell an attempt to unionize its staff, argued that that children don't have the legal capacity to sign union cards because they're too immature. And I think you can appreciate the irony of that. Okay, now I'm hitting this forward button and nothing's happening. Okay, so I just tap the screen there. Here's an instance in which a Conservative MP, he's still an MP, and made the statement, it's now almost 6.5 years ago, but it kind of made me proud, and I hope that he truly meant this. This is during the standing committee hearing, and I think some of you were testified at that hearing, but there were a number of witnesses that were arguing, despite the very small amount of evidence about the benefits of media literacy training, some witnesses were arguing that that was the way to go, and he strongly disagreed with that proposition, saying that it really should be the responsibility, I think it was implicit in government, of ensuring that the marketers stop doing this, and not that we train the children to recognize advertising better. Okay, so Quebec has restrictions on advertising directed at children under the age of 13. Likewise, Norway, although in that case it's under the age of 12. Sweden also has a ban on advertising, although it's just television advertising. And, as I mentioned earlier, a number of provincial governments have restrictions on market or on misrepresentation and deceptive advertising, including the Ontario Consumer Protection Act. Okay. Now, the United States and the United Kingdom did 2 studies recently. This is the United Kingdom study because they implemented this rule limiting high-fat, sugar, and salt foods being depicted in advertisements directed at children under the age of 16. And it was much ballyhooed advancement. And they did this very comprehensive review of the before and after to find out how effective it was. And to my mind, it was a bit disappointing. You can see I've pointed with the 2 red arrows to the operative charts. Prior to the ban, about 4/5 of advertisements directed at children under the age of 16 were for these types of food, these high-fat, sugar, and salt foods. 4/5, and then afterwards it was 3/5. And I don't really know why the effect was not all that dramatic. It may be that that this tracked advertisements that they were seeing by watching programs targeted at older children. But anyway, it didn't seem like it was a dramatic thing, and I think people have to recognize that it's not just about turning the tap off. You have to be very careful about precisely how you design these rules. It's very difficult to study population level interventions, and we've seen that with the restrictions on advertising in Quebec. But one research team based at University of Illinois and University of British Columbia did a study a couple of years ago, and it's a very complicated methodology, but they basically compared English and French children in Quebec to English and French children in Ontario, and did many kind of complicated comparisons and stratifications and so forth. And in the end, they concluded that the benefit of the restrictions on advertising to children in Quebec resulted in $88 million less being spent on fast food, which is a 13% lower amount. There's a study published just a couple of months ago in December by the U.S. Federal Trade Commission. It's a follow-up report. That's what the FU stands for. My kids, my kids are 8 and 9 years old, and they know that they're not allowed to swear, but they are intrigued by swearing. And they've also discovered an app on the internet where you can translate to pretty much any language in the world. And so now they're swearing in Chinese and Turkish and Greek and so forth. But anyway, so I think that an interesting thing about this study is this basically cataloged the food advertisements by, it was the top 60 companies or something like that. They were all required by subpoena to provide this information to the Federal Trade Commission. And anyway, so the interesting thing about this is, I don't know if you can see those charts, but the second bar from the right is carbonated beverages, and the fourth bar, the really big one from the right, is restaurant foods. And those are two product categories for which it is exceedingly easy to skirt a nutrient-based restriction on advertising, because, by way of example, carbonated beverages, just advertise Diet Coke, or just advertise the brand. Everybody knows the brand. It's a reminder to buy. And in the case of restaurant foods, no restriction on Ronald McDonald, no restriction on advertising McDonald's or Tim Hortons or Subway, provided you don't show a sandwich or that runs afoul of the nutrient criteria. Or maybe you show a salad. I think I've seen advertisements during Quebec television program at Saturday morning advertising coffee and salads, seemingly being targeted to adults. Anyway. And this is essentially the same chart for older children, age 12 to 17. I've been doing advocacy on this issue for many years, and it never ceased to amaze me that people assume that Concerned Children's Advertisers is a public health group. And I just invite you to go to their website and check out their members. And I think I've done this some time ago. I think somebody from that group is here, but Nestle, Pepsi, Coke, McDonald's, Cadbury's, McCain's, Campbell's, Frito-Lay, these are their members. And so I think you have to bear that in mind. I know I've even got some angry calls from subscribers to our newsletter saying, they heard something about this group and they thought it was great. And anyway, so I thought I would just bring that to your attention. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. My name is Manuel Arango. I'm Director of Health Policy at the Heart and Stroke Foundation. Everyone knows me as Manny, and my kids call me other things, but we won't get into that right now. Okay. This is going to be...
Just click down.
Oh, that. Got it.
There you go.
Okay, thank you very much. So my objective today in my presentation is to essentially to discuss two approaches for the restriction of marketing to kids. And my focus, of course, will be on a little bit different from Bill's. It will be on a nutrition-based ban versus a ban on all commercial marketing to kids. So a little bit about the foundation. Bill, you got a chance? I have to plug my organization as well. Our mission is to reduce and eliminate heart disease and stroke. In September 2011, we became one organization. Previously, we were a federated organization. So we now have one board, one CEO, and it makes us much more effective in terms of delivering our mission. And one last shameless plug. We have a campaign out right now. It's called the Make Health Last campaign. You've probably seen it on TV. We're trying to educate Canadians about the fact that they're spending the last 10 years of their life in sickness. And so our message is, as a society, we really need to work to reduce the gap between our health span and our lifespan to improve our quality of life towards end of life. And if you go to our website, you can do a little risk factor assessment. At the foundation, we've had a focus on children and youth for the last couple of years. As well, obesity has certainly been an issue and a concern for us for many years now. Of course, the rates of childhood obesity are quite high in Canada, as we know, and there's been a tripling of those rates over the last decade. And if I could get to that slide, it's stuck again. Got it. Slowly but surely. So, so everyone's familiar, I think, with this slide as well. There's tripling of obesity rates over the last decade. And as was indicated earlier this morning, Susie, it's very expensive to society. It costs to society of overweight and obesity. And just like with tobacco, we do know that if you have the risk factor at an early age, the likelihood of it persisting into adulthood is very, very high. So that's why it's very critical to prevent weight gain, and so it doesn't persist into adulthood. And of course, an issue related to this is definitely the issue of marketing to kids. So what do we know from the evidence? And Bill touched upon this very briefly. We do know from literature reviews that the marketing of food and beverage to kids does impact their food and beverage consumption and choices. No doubt about that. We also know that the majority of foods and beverages marketed to kids are not healthy. And although we can't prove causality, we can conclude that unhealthy food and beverage choices most certainly do contribute to childhood obesity. In Canada, we don't have a lot of research to track what is going on with respect to marketing to kids, the prevalence. However, what we do know, the research has taken place on TV, and we know that there is a high level of food advertising to kids, and that most of it, the nutritional quality, is quite low. We also know that marketing to kids takes place in a lot of different environments, not just on TV. It's really multifaceted. So this gives you an inkling of what we need to do to really grapple with this particular issue. Got to cover a lot of mediums. So the question is, what do we do? So there's a lot of potential interventions that we can undertake. We can, some have suggested media literacy, equipping children to better handle, manage, and interpret marketing to kids. Others have suggested potentially eliminating the tax write-offs on the marketing of unhealthy foods and beverage to kids, so that's for the companies. Others have suggested denormalizing the food industry, public education, etc. And the two that really want to focus in on today, though, however, is the nutrition-based ban and a total ban on all commercial marketing to kids. So Bill did talk about, as did Susie, on the Quebec model, and that is the perfect example of a total ban on all commercial marketing to children. It does focus on kids under 13 years of age, where 15% or more of the audience are children, and it does cover TV, radio, and theoretically internet, even though I believe in practice it hasn't been quite effective at that. And we do know that it has been somewhat efficacious in terms of reducing junk food consumption. As well, there have been some other positive outcomes associated with this particular approach. However, my concern and concern of my organization is that this approach, it's a blunt instrument and it has some unintended consequences. In particular, it prohibits the commercial marketing of healthy foods and beverages to kids. It prohibits the commercial marketing of products that promote physical activity. And also, and this isn't something that's necessarily particular to this approach, however, it is part of it, has occurred there, and it's been mentioned by Susie earlier on as well, that it does allow the marketing of unhealthy food and beverages during children's programming if it's directed to adults. So a study was put out a couple of years ago by Minnie Potvin, Kent, Lise Dubois, and others, which showed that the total amount of advertising hadn't really changed because of this loophole of allowing advertising directed to adults during children's programming. So with respect to a nutrient-based approach, the model that exemplifies this approach is the United Kingdom model, which Bill also referred to. It is nutrition-based. It prohibits the advertising of foods that are high in fat, sugar, sodium, and it is directed to kids 4 to 15 years old. The big drawback is that it only focuses on TV, so it's very restrictive in terms of the mediums that it covered. It covered other marketing mediums through a voluntary code. So once again, as Bill had indicated, the results, they were kind of good and bad. The good was that you did get a bit of a reduction in terms of the marketing on TV to kids. However, and the big however is that it was offset by increases in other marketing mediums. So you got an overall net increase. So that certainly wasn't expected and it was an unintended consequence. We ended up with increased marketing in print, outdoor, and cinema. So in the end, it really did not, and as well, it did not prevent children's exposure to the marketing of junk food if it was directed to adults. So it also had the similar problem that the Quebec legislation had in that respect. In response, the British Heart Foundation indicated that they had to do better and called on the government to introduce consistent regulations that would cover all forms of media and all forms of advertising techniques. Although those results weren't entirely positive, I think they can be explained by the lack of comprehensiveness with respect to the medium coverage. That said, I did want to point out a study that was undertaken in Australia by Boyd Swinburne and his colleagues. And they did some economic modeling and looked at the various potential interventions to address children's health. And they did conclude via some economic modeling that the reduction of TV advertising to kids for foods high in fat and sugar would be potentially very effective in terms of producing a very good population health gain and reducing disability adjusted life years. So if you can look here, you can see that it was significantly, that particular intervention was significantly more effective in terms of cost effectiveness versus a whole ton of other programs. As I indicated earlier, one drawback of the total ban approach is that you are prohibited from marketing healthy foods and beverages to kids. So I'd like to briefly refer to a study that came out of the University of Waterloo. So one of the authors, David Hammond, some of you may know him. He was a tobacco control guru, and now he's become a nutrition guru. So we're very happy that he's doing work in nutrition. In this particular study, what they did was it was inspired by some work that by a ban, actually a regulation that was implemented in California in 2 jurisdictions that only allowed toy premiums for healthy foods and beverages. So in this particular study, there was a control group and an intervention group. In the control group, Healthy meals and unhealthy meals were offered to children. They had an option to choose one of those, and toy premiums were attached to all of the meals. In the intervention group, once again, the same meals were offered to the children. They had a choice of a healthy or unhealthy, but this time around, a toy premium was only accompanied the healthy meals. So what was the outcome of this study? No surprise. What they found was that in the intervention group, 40% of the kids chose the healthy meal compared to 19% in the control group. So this study beautifully, simply, and succinctly, I think, illustrates the potential impact and efficacy of allowing the marketing of healthy foods and beverages to kids, and I think supports a nutrient-based approach. So why a nutrient-based approach? It promotes good health. For our organization, the Heart and Stroke Foundation, our mission is to improve the heart health of Canadians. So for us, this approach makes all the sense in the world. It's a refined approach that restricts the marketing of unhealthy foods and beverages to kids. It allows for the marketing of healthy foods and beverages to kids. Why would we want to prohibit the marketing of low-fat milk to children or the marketing of fruits and vegetables to kids? As well, under a nutrient-based approach, you'd have the option of still continuing to market health-promoting physical activity products to children. Once again, why would we want to ban the marketing of skates, tennis rackets, basketballs, hockey equipment to children? It doesn't make sense from a health perspective. So we have to harness the power of positive marketing, I think, for health. And we have to ask ourselves the question, is it appropriate to make healthy foods fun if it leads to a better diet and better health for children? This slide was inserted at the last moment, and it wasn't inspired by Yanni. I guess he's not here now. He mentioned that it was impossible to define healthy and unhealthy foods. Well, in our opinion, it certainly is doable. We realize it's not an easy task. However, the UK did it. Nutrition logo programs across the world do it. And governments have guidelines for healthy foods in schools. And in particular, here in Canada, federal, provincial, territorial governments are revising the guidelines for food in schools. So it's not exactly an impossibility. I think that was a little bit of hyperbole, but that's fine. As well, nutrition-based approach has a lot of public support. In polling we did recently, up to a couple of years ago, found that 82% of Canadians were supportive of restrictions to the marketing of unhealthy foods and beverages to kids. As well, many organizations are very supportive of that approach as well. The Chronic Disease Prevention Alliance of Canada, as well as a National Hypertension Advisory Group, is also very supportive of that approach. And I know that Tara from the Hypertension Advisory Committee is here in the audience. Hello, Tara. And these approaches are supported by a variety of groups: Canadian Cancer Society, Canadian Diabetes Association, Canadian Medical Association, Nurses Association, Pharmacists Association, College of Family Physicians of Canada, Heart and Stroke Foundation, etc., etc. So good base of support. So just some very quick concluding thoughts. We do believe that a nutrition-based approach is the ideal starting point. It gets to the heart of the matter, no pun intended. And it also permits the marketing of health-promoting products, which leads to good health. Some general considerations, regardless of which approach you favor, bottom line is that all approaches must be comprehensive in terms of covering a broad marketing environment. Otherwise, they just will not succeed. And as well, it's very important, and what we've learned from both of these approaches, it's very important to eliminate all exposure to marketing to kids in terms of junk food, including marketing directed to adults. So thank you very much.
Sure, actually, I'm going to deliver it from here if that's okay.
Do you have any slides?
No, no slides. No.
Okay, sure.
I've been asked to be something I'm not today, and that is to represent industry views. on the subject. And I say that because I am not in industry. I am first and foremost an academic. Um, but because I am an academic in a school of business, I think it was presumed that I would understand some of industry's sensitivities. Before I give you my reaction to some of the things that you've heard today already, let me first put out my personal bias. I think it's important to do so in a subject like this. First, I have two dimensions of my life that tug at me on this issue. The first is a personal dimension. I am a type 2 diabetic, so I am well aware of the health consequences. Even though I am not overweight, don't smoke, exercise regularly, and do everything else, I am genetically predisposed towards being a type 2 diabetic. It's a fact of life, and I understand the negative consequences that has. More importantly, I am a father of 4. In fact, I am a man who defines his existence as being a father of 4. And as such, I have to tell you that I have an emotional, in fact, I have a visceral response to anything that adversely affects the health of my children, and that is to do away with it. But professionally, I am philosophically and intellectually predisposed to a free market governed by consumer sovereignty. I believe the consumer makes choices. I believe that companies ultimately are regulated by the choices consumers make. Now, as somebody who trains marketers who do all the bad things you've heard about all day, that might lead you to expect that I have let my professional overcome my personal predispositions on this subject. I have not. I am one who firmly believes in regulation. And I believe in it for a simple reason. A free market assumes a free consumer. And the evidence, as Bill notes, is overwhelming. There is absolutely no question. Children are unable to form rational evaluations of the advertising they're exposed to. In other words, the whole economic concept of perfect information is completely violated in this context, at least when a child is in the audience. Of that, there is no question. And so you have to say to yourself, if that's the case, then we would be negligent as a society if we did not in some way monitor what goes on to the eyeballs and ears of our children. The problem, of course, is that the devil is in the detail. And I think in that regard, there are probably 3, maybe 4 things that industry would look for in any regulation. And please understand, industry can live with regulation. That's not a problem. There are lots of regulations governing industry today. They manage to live within them. The problem is not all regulation is necessarily good regulation, and not all regulation is necessarily fair regulation. First thing industry wants to see is a science-based, not philosophy-based set of regulations. What they want are things that can be shown to be to have an impact on people. And this is hard, because on one hand it seems so obvious, doesn't it? I mean, there's enough science to say that nutrition leads to bad eating, or advertising affects nutrition and eating habits, and therefore, if we have a problem with obesity, there must be some causal link, right? We can also make that observation, by the way, about the performance of the stock market and the height of women's skirts. Higher the skirts are, higher the market tends to be. Why? Nobody knows. We can statistically validate that observation, however, but it's a completely spurious correlation. And so in this instance, industry is saying, look, I don't want somebody who sits, and I'm going to use the term in what may seem a pejorative manner, but please don't take it that way. I don't want some left-wing pinko commie sitting there telling me what I can and can't do in a free enterprise business. You're going to have a rule, make it science-based, or else what have we got? An argument about who brings the best order to the regulatory table, about who's most persuasive in a room of 5 or 6 panelists. That's no way to run a business. It's not consistent. And consistency is really important because what industry looks at is they say, all right, so tell me, what is unhealthy? I mean, sugar is bad, but a little bit of sugar is, in fact, good for you. Salt is bad, but a little bit of salt is, in fact, good for you. And while I do agree with Manuel, you know, the notion here, sorry, man, the idea of an,
At least you didn't call me a left-wing political carnage.
I've been called first, man. You know, but I think the idea of a nutrition-based approach is a very good one. But you have to also come back to something Bill drew our attention to in his presentation. Coke may not be nutritionally sound. Diet Coke? Tough one, isn't it? I can ban regular Coca-Cola, the soft drink, can't ban Diet Coke, and certainly can't ban the brand name of Coca-Cola because it represents a lot more than just a soft drink. Now you've got questions about equity amongst industry participants. Does the firm that doesn't have a corporate brand, that doesn't have the funds to produce a corporate brand, does the firm that doesn't have a diet equivalent, are they unjustly being serviced by this regulation? Again, I believe in a nutrition-based approach. You just have to be very careful with some of those periphery issues that surround it. Who is a child? Is it 8, 12, 16, 21? I mean, we've always had problems identifying the age of majority. I mean, when I was younger, the big complaint was I can have a beer, or sorry, I can't have a beer, but I can go fight in Vietnam. Well, the same would apply in this instance. At what point do we draw the line? What aspects do we govern? Is it just advertising? Is it advertising plus labeling? Is it advertising plus labeling plus the internet, plus product placements? I think we could all agree with that. How about Timmy's Little League Hockey? Ronald McDonald House? The milk calendar? Now we got problems, don't we? Now we got problems. It's just not consistent, is it? You do away with one, you got to do away with them all because there's also overwhelming evidence that says, you know what? Advertising is not the only cue that people respond to. People respond to the internet. They respond to labeling. They respond to any number of other marketing cues beyond just what's shown on TV. And so if all you do is block TV, all you're doing is slightly altering the rules of the game. You're not fundamentally changing the game. I think we also have to be a little bit concerned with the notion that if we impose a ban, then there are some positive things, as Manny talked about. We're not going to be able to market healthy food. But we're also going to have some other consequences. There are arenas that won't be built, scoreboards that won't be financed, summer camps that won't be financed. All of those are marketing influences. You have to consider those alongside advertising because they are just as impactful on creating a positive glow around those brand names. And if you're going to do that, then you have to be ready for communities to stand up and say, where's the money going to come from? And now the pressure moves to government. And we've all seen what's happened with government funding of the arts, sports programs, and the like. It is woefully lacking. And so you are going to get some pushback, even from government in that sense, because they're in a deficit now. You can expect what their reaction is going to be to this situation. These are just, I think, some of the issues. We could go all day on some of the finer points we have to deal with in dealing with these details. I mention them, though, because these are things that industry would want clarification of. And if we cannot give that clarification, and if we do indeed believe, as I do, that nothing is more important than the health and welfare of our children, then we have no choice but to impose a complete and total ban. In other words, if we cannot resolve these issues, then we've got to go all the way and say, fine, we'll throw out the baby with the bathwater, or we feel we have to do this because the bathwater is just so toxic in its current state. But if we do that, then we have to be ready for three other consequences. Right? We have to be ready for the funding consequences. It will come up. There are sponsorships that will be lost, and those sponsorships do represent a very real cost to all of us. There are economic impacts. There's no question industry will respond to a loss of business with a loss of employment. And no government is going to promote anything that promotes more unemployment. There will also be a cost of monitoring and policing. That cost will be reflected in the prices of goods. That will, of course, have some impact on core inflation rates, which in turn can have impact on prices and so on. And I'm not an economist, although that's about as much as I know. And then finally, and I think the big question of all, is we have to decide how much onus is on parents. Forget literacy programs, we're parents. We make choices. We make choices for our kids. Why? For the very reason regulation is necessary. They are unable to form rational evaluations in all cases. We cannot and should not expect regulation to take the form, to replace parenthood. At some point, we must take ownership ourselves of our situation. I hasten to add here my personal position. If we can't overcome these points of distinction, then we have no choice but to go to a total ban. But when we go to the total ban, just remember, you got to be careful what you wish for, because it also brings some other consequences. Life, as they say, is about trade-offs. Thank you.
I think what I'll do before I open the floor up to the audience is allow the panelists 1 minute to make their final remarks before we open up the floor. So, Bill, if you want to go first, and then Manny, and then Ken.
Yeah, sure. I just want to follow up on a couple of comments that were made. First of all, I mean, Ken, I'm not going to hold you responsible for representing the interests of the food industry or any other industry. But as a citizen and a parent, I find it objectionable and surprising to imagine that the economic welfare of Canada hinges on the continued ability of companies to trick children. You know, I mean, that's not acceptable to me. And my sense is that representatives from Tim Hortons and some of these other McDonald's and some of these other groups that sponsor these charities wouldn't put it that way, because it would be a friggin' public relations disaster for them to say so. But anyway, just put that out there. And with regard to this, the point about this study that was done, this national experiment in California, indicating that giving a toy with a healthy meal leads to more kids choosing the healthy meal. Manny, you represent that as kind of unequivocal evidence that we should continue to allow advertising directed at children for healthy things. But the thing is, healthy things aren't advertised to children. I think we have to recognize what the market is like. Healthy things are not advertised to children because they sell themselves. Parents don't need to be persuaded to buy broccoli or skim milk. They don't need, dairy advertisements. They don't advertise 1% or less milk. They just advertise dairy. They advertise cheese. You have to recognize what the situation is that we're dealing with. And on the point about advertising skates and so forth, I mean, who needs to see an advertisement to provoke the view that you want to buy a pair of skates? I mean, it's snow coming down. A few years ago, we did some research on this. I looked at about 5,000 advertisements, not just to children, but to adults, 5,000 TV ads. And I think I found 8 ads that were for products that were unequivocally oriented toward physical activity. They were for running shoes. I think there was one basketball ad, and it was one that I called a skate ad, but it was really an ad for Sears, I think, and they showed a picture of the skates among 10 other things. It was around Christmas time. So there were like 5,000 ads. There were 8 that were obviously for physical activity things. so many more. And I never cease to be amazed. Nobody talks about all of the mountains of advertisements, way more than for foods, for products that make kids, that in order to use them, you have to sit down, like the video games and all the toys that you have to sit down to use. Nobody talks about that. Not even the physical activity community talks about that, which is mystifying.
Okay, thank you very much. And so I'd like to respond to a couple things Ken and both Bill have said. So I'm not sure that the data is very clear in terms of how much advertising there is out there for health promoting products. I'll give you an example. Even something like the Nintendo Wii, which some studies have shown does lead to physical activity. That product is advertised, and would we necessarily want to prohibit that? I know that's not the best example, but you mentioned you'd surveyed 5,000 advertisements. I haven't seen
Advertising to adults, maybe.
Well, if it happens during children's programming, it can be considered to kids, and some is directed to kids. So I don't think the results are all that conclusive, though. So I think, quite honestly, philosophically, the nutrition-based approach just makes a lot more sense. I'd like to see more data. A couple other things just to react to a couple of Ken's comments. Ken, you mentioned that consumers influence markets and what the food industry provides in terms of products can also work the other way. Marketing can drive consumer behavior. Reformulation of products can lead to change in terms of what people consume and can create demand. If you create higher sodium products, that changes the palate for consumers. So it's not just bottom up, and top down also works, right? So that does have an impact. With respect to brand sponsorships, I think if you do through a nutrition-based approach, it is possible to address brand sponsorships. For example, all you have to do is establish a threshold. If X% of their products are unhealthy, then you could argue, okay, that company cannot use its brand in sponsorships. However, if a company only has 2 unhealthy products out of a product line of 100, then that wouldn't really make sense to ban that particular brand sponsorship. So not quite a black and white issue when it comes to brand sponsorships. And I think both Bill and I completely agree with you. You did mention that it's not just about advertising, marketing and other mediums is also important. You have to address that. We concur fully with that.
Let me start being a marketer. Let me start with an ad. I agree completely with Mandy. Marketing drives consumer behavior, and that's why I'm moderating a panel right after this with Barry Martin on fighting fire with fire, using marketing for those purposes. Now that I'm through the self-serving part. I've sat on a bunch of juries and task forces and so on this issue. And at some point, everybody throws up their hand and says, I don't get it. Why are governments so damn stupid? The issue is so blatantly obvious. The priority on kids is so damn clear. How can they not move? And the answer is, well, it's not what they say in the ads. It's not that they tell you in the ads that there's a negative effect on the economy. But I'll bet you dollars for donuts behind closed doors in front of a minister, yeah, it comes up. It definitely comes up each and every time. Not because it necessarily drives the economy, but it has an economic impact. And what MP wants to see a plant close or jobs lost in their riding? It would be a PR nightmare for them to cite it, but that's not where the damage is done. The damage is done in other places. I should also say, by the way, when it comes to the use of toys or other devices, industry, like everybody, always has a concern about whether a practice represents the thin edge of the wedge. Right? Toys are not a function of food, therefore just ban all toys in the context of food, whether healthy or unhealthy. Well, if you drive a car, I can guarantee you most of what you drive and most of what is promoted is not a function of a car. You don't need an MP3 player to drive a car. You don't need sophisticated electronics to turn your dashboard into the Batmobile to drive a car. And even when it comes to promoting healthy products like skates, find me a skate that isn't associated with an NHL hockey player. You're not going to find it, right? You want to ban it, but hey, you got to do it everywhere. And now we're talking about massive implications. You've got to have some way of drawing those fine lines in the sand. And you know, again, draw them. Just draw them. Wherever you draw them, industry will abide. It doesn't have a choice. The stakes are too high. But you have to come down with some kind of very firm statement that says, this is why it's allowed and this is why it's not allowed. And so if you want to say, you know, if 6/8 of your income comes from products that we consider non-nutritional, by whatever standard that is, you can't put scoreboards in a community rink. That's fine, we can live with that. Just tell us what the guideline is. As long as you leave it undefined, we're not happy. Don't leave it up to a task force or a tribunal to decide on a case-by-case basis. That doesn't work. It's too expensive and it's too inconsistent. Now the game becomes, which tribunal do I want to fight this case out in? You know, does one community have a record of greater liberal tendencies than another community? Just tell us rules. Tell us rules. I can guarantee you I'll teach the rules in the classroom, because to do otherwise would be negligent. And we're only this far away from product liability as it sits now. Right? Just tell us the rules. Right? But you're going to have to make those rules very specific. When you're pitching this, don't waste time on the, you know, does advertising affect it? Of course it affects consumption. I wouldn't have a job otherwise. Right? Are kids able to form rational evaluation? We're parents. We know they're not. You know, you don't have to drive that home. And yet, every time I sit in on a task force, 3/4 of our time is covering all of that ground. And only 25% at most is spent on the harsh reality of why the regulation is not going to go through. Because we can't come up with these very specific guidelines.
Thank you, Ken. All right, well, thanks to the panelists. I'd like to open up the floor. Unfortunately, we have just about under 10 minutes, so 7 minutes to the audience to ask questions of the panel. Any questions?
While people are rushing up to the microphone. Ken, I can't believe that the reason why we don't have a law restricting advertising to children is because nobody has bothered to articulate the details of it. That's not the case at all. It's not. There's not what I said. Well, you said people are spending so much time talking about evidence. Tell us what the rules are, right?
Oh, the rules that have been provided right now are inadequate. They don't meet any of the criteria. They're not consistent. They're not
sorry,
fair.
Are you talking about proposed rules or existing rules?
Proposed rules.
I'm sorry, you're talking about
the existing rules are inadequate. Your own presentation supports that.
Bill C-430. That's not adequate. It's like, is that what you're talking about? Bill C-430.
You mean the Quebec regulation?
No, the federal proposal.
No, it's not.
Well, anyway, I'm happy to talk later about what's deficient about that. But there are proposals that are out there, and I think Quebec is evidence of.
So I can't advertise to an 8-year-old, but I can advertise to his 9-year-old brother and trust that the 9-year-old is not going to influence the 8-year-old. Come on.
Read the proposal. The other thing is this whole thing about corporations contributing positively to communities through things like Ronald McDonald House. I mean, I think it would be interesting for us to kind of quantify that. We have, I think we've all quantified the impact of nutrition-related illness on Canadian society. And if there is a financial benefit to these charity programs, then those have to be kind of weighed in the balance. I thought it was interesting. One of the concerns that the Teachers Association has is about financial involvement in school programs, and they did a survey a few years ago and found that on average, corporate contributions are about $10,000 per school, which struck me as a very small amount. considering by far the enormous amount of money that governments spend at schools to hire teachers and the buildings and maintenance and all that sort of thing.
The schools are distinct from sports programs, recreational programs, and arts programs. Schools have been the exception because marketers are not felt to have the integrity. If we sponsor a course, for example, then we want to have a say in the content of that course. And it's simply felt that in a public institution, you cannot have those marketing influences. Fine.
That's great.
Far be it from me to argue with that, but the notion is that's why we don't go in schools. But yeah, I don't look at any arena in this country. It's a hockey crazy country. Look at any arena in this country. Look at a scoreboard that doesn't have ads attached to it. Look at the construction of any arena and ask the question, where do we look for financing except naming rights?
Yeah,
Well, perhaps it's just.
Hi, sir. We have a question from the audience, if we might allow her to.
I just want to know, I mean, usually I hear Bill Jeffery's argument that it's a much cleaner argument and it's been upheld by the Supreme Court of Canada, so that makes sense. But if we were to go nutritional-based approach, I'd like to hear any of your testimony, especially how you would go about defining nutritional standards when we don't really have clear understanding of what is too much sugar, what's not too much sugar, what's too much sodium, what's not too much sodium. Like, to me, that's the basis. How are we going to define that?
Well, okay, it might not be popular to say this among some circles, but I think in Canada we have to start with the food guide and then build and improve upon that. And then also look at what's been done in other jurisdictions. In the UK, they did it. They did define what was unhealthy, high fat, sugar, sodium. Obvious, so you would have to strike probably, I know it's not popular, a task force, but a task force to look for a made in Canada solution. It's not impossible. There are other standards out there that could help us come up with a solution. It would take a little bit of work, absolutely.
Standards, like for example, in Ontario, we have like 50 nutrition standards. I've worked at the frontline level supporting schools implementing those standards, and some of Johnny's examples that you presented earlier do show that there's so many loopholes in the standards that I'm not sure that the purpose has been achieved, like that we're changing consumption behavior of our children. So I'm kind of, we've had this conversation for years. I've been at several conferences where this conversation has happened, and yet we're coming back here again, having the same conversation. And
Well, that's public health, yeah. Sure. No, I mean, it happens, right?
bottom line is, what nutrition standards are going to allow us to do the approach that you have said?
Can I give you a somewhat different take on the subject? We just changed our grading system in Queens. You know, we used to grade on a numeric system from 0 to 100. And that had a lot of trouble, especially if you're not teaching a course in quantitative methods where there's a black and white answer. It's always somewhat subjective. And then the question becomes, is this an 83 paper or an 82? And then you get the student who's really paranoid who comes in and says, geez, you know, you gave me a 95, I think I deserve a 96. And you want to, you know, put a bullet between his eyes. So we went to a simple system this year. We said, you know what? You read a paper, you know if it's an A paper. You know, I mean, you can feel it. So we're going to have a grade that says A, right? You read another paper, you know it's a failing paper. You don't need a new number to know it's a failing paper. It's a failing paper. It doesn't do what it's supposed to do. You give it a failing grade. And in between, you have a couple of gradients. But it's a very easy process. You know, there's only 4 available grades.
So sorry.
I've never been able to figure out why we can't do this with food. You know, we've got some obvious things that are simply wrong. So ban them. Just ban them. And then we've got some others where it's a more marginal case. There we require a little more study, task forces, what have you. Accept the fact that there's going to be some imperfections at the boundary. But you've got some obvious cases right now that you can get rid of. I mean, if something had, I don't know, just, I'm not a health official, something had 80% sugar content, you wouldn't need a task force to decide that that's too much sugar. If something, a teaspoon represents 35% of your sodium content, that's too much salt. You don't have to be Einstein to know that. Ban that stuff right away. And then the other stuff, we can do that over time.
So Bill, just one last comment and then we'll need to go to the next speaker.
Are we out of time for questions?
I think,
No, just very quickly. The World Health Organization years ago decided they would do something called nutrient profiling, which is precisely this, setting nutrition criteria. They have yet to do it, and they probably won't do it. They're creating manuals so that countries can do it themselves because they realize how controversial it is. I think that this would create no end to problems. The reason why this is so different from the case of giving grades to students is you don't have individual students that have $6 billion in assets that, if they were unfavorably treated by your criteria, wouldn't sue your ass off for years, or go to the president of the university if they disagree. That's a difference. I mean, it's a tremendous power imbalance.
Well, that's why I have to be science-based.
Hi.
Well,
You have to be aggressive. Otherwise.
So I very much appreciate hearing your perspectives, and I can't help but just voice that I hear a lot of contradictions in what's being said. And what stands out most is, the talk about there being, a need for evidence-based, correlations. You can make correlations between all sorts of things. But the problem is that we know that there's lack of funding for rigorous research on these health-related topics. And what you were saying about a failing paper being obviously a failing paper and the paper being an obviously paper, I mean, we can all say that as well when we look at statistics of health and what's been happening over the last 30 years. And and your comment just about how, the dollars are going to have to come for things like scoreboards and arenas. Scoreboards and arenas, watching hockey and baseball and football on TV is not getting children out and doing physical activity. As for footballs and baseballs on TV, is not getting children out doing those activities. There's ample statistics showing that they're at the lowest levels ever of physical activity. Children are getting the most minor percentage of physical activity that's recommended. So, and also there's lack of funding because government's spending so much money on health. So, there has to be a broader look at these things and not be so narrow.
Well, and first of all, I think it's important to understand advertisements on scoreboards and arenas are not directed at promoting more physical activity. It's people who are there being exposed to an ad and therefore being influenced in their nutrition choices. That's the argument I'm making there. It's not that it doesn't promote physical activity. I would agree with you 100%. On the funding issue, I think government, I have the same question. To me, it's a trade-off, right? I mean, I either spend it here or I spend it on healthcare. And you look at the proportion of provincial budgets on healthcare, you got to wonder why they've been so slow to recognize it. And I don't know the answer to that. What I can tell you, though, is this. What really surprises me is the absolute lack of activity on the part of healthy food producers to counter this material. If I'm eating less junk food, then I'm presumably eating something else instead, which means that any losses and my entire argument about economic impact, that activity, that business should be going to healthier foods. There is something to be gained. There is a necessary investment, though, that they have to make in that research. They can't sit by and wait for the government to open the door and say, there you go, we're going to restrict the market, now you can make more money. They want to make it happen, let them make the same investments.
okay, I'm going to have to wrap this up because we do have a speaker who's waiting right now to speak. But I believe the panelists will be here into the break. And perhaps for those of you who have questions or would like to make further comments to them, you can take advantage of that. I'm going to ask that Grant Gordon and Brian Heineman come up and, Brian Cook, come up and begin the next presentation. So thank you to the panel. Very lively debate and much appreciated.